Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute for our biannual reflection on elections. We are happy to be joined today by a great panel of folks to really pick apart some of the key races and key outcomes that we saw happen on Tuesday and talk about the implications, talking at the state level, talking at the national level. A couple things before we begin. 1 week from today, so next Thursday, at 11:30 in the morning, Cammie Anderson, Superintendent of Newark Public Schools, will be giving an address and then having a conversation here. So 11:30 next Thursday, be sure to put that on your calendar. For those of you following along at home, this is being live streamed at the same time on AEI's website. If you'd like to follow along on Twitter, about the last half hour or so, we're going to open up questions to the crowd and those that are happening online. There's a hashtag, and if you also just want to sort of argue with each other while we're arguing up here, feel free to use that as well. The hashtag is EdElections, so EDELECTIONS, hashtag EdElections. You can also tweet questions directly to me. I will try to work them into the conversation, and I'm at MQ_McShane. So use the hashtag, tweet questions at me, and that's what we'll do. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists and then begin peppering them with questions. So if we start at the far end of the dais, we have Charlie Barone, who's the Director of Policy at Democrats for Education Reform. He's led DFER's efforts advising President Obama's transition team and runs all of their policy there. He's also a Capitol Hill veteran. He was top advisor to the late Senator Paul Simon and to Representative George Miller, under whom he acted as lead negotiator for House Democrats on the No Child Left Behind Act. Next to him, we have Bethany Little, who's a principal at Education Council. Before joining Education Council, she served as managing partner at America Achieves, where she led a number of the organization's priorities. And before that, she was chief education counsel to the chairman of the U.S. Senate's Health, Education, Labors, and Pensions Committee. Next to Bethany, we have Allison Klein, who's a reporter at Education Week, where she covers federal policy, including the U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, waivers, and competitive grant programs. She's also co-author of the very popular and an absolute necessity to read if you do what we do, Politics K-12 blog. Next to Allison, we have Jeannie Allen, who's the founder and president emeritus of the Center for Education Reform. She's written books including the School Reform Handbook, How to Improve Your Schools, and more recently, Education Reform Before It Was Cool, that just came out this year. And then finally, last but certainly not least, often imitated, never duplicated, Rick Hess, resident scholar, director of education policy studies here at AEI. He also pens a popular Education Week blog called Rick Hess Straight Up and has authored or edited a shelf full of books, including Cage Busting Leadership, The Same Thing Over and Over, Spinning Wheels, and many more. So thank you all for joining us today. I want to go ahead and start with a couple kind of lightning round questions to get the kind of conversation going, and then we'll dig in. So maybe I'll start with Charlie and work our way back this way. So the first question I have, real quick answer, what was the most surprising result that you saw on Tuesday? Most surprising result, maybe a couple sentences on what it was. Oh, and you need to press your button if you're going to talk. That applies to everyone up there. You press the button on your mic. Oh, that one there. Yeah.
Thank you. Mark Warner almost losing was the most surprising thing that I saw. Here's a moderate from a state that's been trending blue, and he came very close to losing. And I think if the election had been a week later, if it had been next Tuesday, he probably would have lost because that's the way he was trending.
Sure. Bethany.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think the problem is with polling, there are very few surprises anymore. You sort of know where the numbers are before the election happens, so it's hard to say there are some things that were disappointing, but less surprising.
So as a Marylander, I was surprised that my home state elected a Republican, and that the same thing happened in Massachusetts.
Jeannie.
They're taking away all my surprises. Yeah, I would add that in a state like Maryland and Massachusetts, and frankly a lot of them where the unions set up and hand out their Apple ballots, and they're like stuffing it in people's faces as they're walking in to the polls, that those Apple ballots were largely discarded in a significant amount of races, including Maryland and Massachusetts.
Great. Rick?
Yeah, I think one is obviously Baker in Massachusetts and Hogan in Maryland. I think the other is just that these vulnerable Republican governors in the Midwest and Florida, Walker, Scott, Snyder, Brownback in Kansas, that they ran the table on those races.
Okay, great. Continuing the lightning round questions, Charlie, I'll kick it back to you. Who had the best night? And don't worry, we'll be coming back with the second half of that question here in a second.
Chris Christie,
And why is that?
because he was technically overseeing all of the governor's races, and because, as Rick said, they really ran the table on a lot of them in states that have had Republican governors before, but I don't think this many all in one year like this in blue states.
Bethany.
David Cleary. Enough said.
Allison.
So I think Bethany had a great answer. I think another good answer, if you look at things from the lens of federal policy, is states. Because I think that we'll have sort of 2 years of gridlock probably still. The Obama administration is more or less on its way out in its twilight years, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use. And all of the interesting policy is going to get made at the state level.
Jeannie.
Bruce Rauner, Illinois, Trump's an incumbent in a state where the president hails from which he hails, excuse me, ending a sentence with a preposition, and just really, really had the support of a tremendous amount of people that nobody thought would come out to vote for him.
Sure. Rick.
Rick Berman.
Right on. See, there was a surprise. You were able to surprise us. That's great. So you know what? I'm going to flip it around and send it back down the dais, Rick, for that one. So who had the worst night?
I think, Randy Weingarten and Lily Eskelsen Garcia had a tough night.
Sure. Jeannie?
I'd have to say it's a tie between Harry Reid and Tom Corbett in Pennsylvania.
Sure.
Sorry, Charlie, but Marshall Tuck.
I'd go with Mark Warner because I just didn't even know for the longest time. That's just painful.
What was the question again?
Who had the worst night?
Harry Reid. Yeah, I have to go with that one.
Sure. Okay, so now
Oh,
let's.
wait, can I add? I think
go ahead.
Charlie had the worst night, actually.
Charlie might have had a bit of a rough night. That is
I'm a veteran in this kind of stuff, trust me. 94 was way worse than.
great. So let's go ahead and dig in for a second on a couple of these folks, these groups that you talked about. So one, let's talk teachers unions, right? So in the run-up to this election, there was talk of spending around or north of $60 million that they tried to make lots of state races referenda on ed issues. In fact, someone so far as to say that they had scores to settle with governors like Scott Walker and Rick Snyder and John Kasich. So what happened? What does that sort of tell us about moving forward? Jeannie, I see you nodding. I might throw it to you first.
So huge miscalculation, Mike, on the part of the teachers' unions that I actually think bodes well for education reform regardless of your party in general. They assume that everybody walking around, just because this has been the tenor of the debate in the last 4 years, loves their school, loves their teacher, right? And frankly, in the urban core, right, people don't love their teacher in their school because they suck for most people. And in the middle class and upper middle class core, there's a lot of question mark about whether or not we're letting somebody else do something to us. They use the two themes that they always use when they seem to win, which is we want to support your schools, we want to support your teachers, we want to make sure more money flows. And in both cases, in those polar opposites, people are like, no, enough, we want change.
Charlie, do you see it the same way or variation on that?
I'm going to make a point I don't know anybody else is going to make, but in the discussion everybody's been having after Tuesday, I think people are confusing unions losing with education getting better. And it just doesn't quite line up that way. I mean, you have cases, I think Scott Walker is a perfect example. This is a guy who put his political career on the line with eliminating collective bargaining, and they haven't done jack with that to improve education in Wisconsin. They're still at the bottom in NAEP. There's no major effort to leverage anything he did on collective bargaining to improve education, and people are clapping for him as if he won some victory. If you hate unions, yeah, he won into some other people. If you're fighting unions because you don't like where they are on education, it's more of a mixed bag right now.
Go ahead.
So, and I think this is actually what Charlie just put his finger on is one of the really interesting divides between conservatives who are education reformers and liberals who are education reformers on this stuff, is look, what Walker is basically Lucy with the football at this point to the unions, right? This is the second time in 3 years that they painted a big neon sign on him, that there was a real sense that they were going to take him out and teach those Republicans a lesson, and the second time he won a pretty comfortable victory, winning by 7 points or so in a purple state. Charlie's right that folks haven't done much to take advantage. It's important to keep in mind that Act 10 didn't abolish collective bargaining. What it did was narrow the scope of collective bargaining to wages and wage-related benefits. And it reduced outlays on pensions and health care. This created a lot of financial room for school systems to A, get their books in order, and to B, reprogram funds into things that are good for kids. Again, Charlie's right that we haven't seen a lot of that. I don't think of that as a failure on the part of a Walker or Wisconsin legislature. I think that points to some of the challenges we have in terms of encouraging school and system leaders to actually take advantage of a changing policy environment. But look, I mean, I think that's the thing, is that what Walker has done, winning 2 of these last 3 years, the recall and then this race, is given a lot of Republicans with national aspirations the sense that it's actually safe to challenge the unions and to push back on things like tenure and the scope of collective bargaining and pensions, even in a purple state. And Thom Tillis getting past Hagan in North Carolina, I think reinforced that.
So Bethany, I'd like to kick over to you, sort of an angle on this question as well, is how much of this was a sort of just bad night for Democrats broadly, and how much of this is sort of a specific sort of thing that unions should be the person that we might identify as having the worst night?
Interestingly, and I'm not sure anybody suggested they had the worst night. I do think this is a referendum on something much, much larger than education. Although, interestingly, for many years we've seen education being almost irrelevant in most elections. And this year it wasn't irrelevant. It actually played more highly in polls than it usually does, and people were caring about education. But I think it's funny that I'm going to say this to a conservative. Usually conservatives tell me, don't confuse the unions with the teachers. And I would say the same thing back, because I think the fact that, I do not think, in fact, the polling shows pretty clearly, people do not hate their teachers. They actually really like their teachers. They really trust their teachers. Parents really trust their teachers. I think what happened with the unions and what happened with the teachers shouldn't necessarily be conflated here.
Go ahead, Jean.
Well, so I actually think we can totally conflate them. And I'm one of the people who has actually said in the past that don't confuse the two. I think there's a bigger issue here, which is we have a public, and in particular parents, who don't really know and get the policy issues, no matter how hard we try for them to understand what it is that's going on in their schools, right? They don't get it, but they are savvy in terms of they know what's right and wrong. They know something's going on that's not quite there, and they don't necessarily blame their teachers or blame their unions verbally, or visually, but there's something about education that doesn't fit, and teachers are part of that. And so where unions used to be able to say, but you need to support your teacher, because if you support your teacher, all these things will happen, they're just not buying any of the line anymore. I think that's where the miscalculation is, right? So when the the North Carolina Education Association sent the stuff home to the teachers, including my mother-in-law, retired public school teacher there, lambasting and screaming about Thom Tillis being the school choice guy, guess what? There's a huge majority of teachers in North Carolina that voted for him. They don't care. They don't care if it did school choice. Like, it didn't bother them. Like 10 years ago, they would have gone screaming out of a building. They basically said, hey, he's a really good guy. It's kind of cool. He's trying to do something different. Doesn't bother me. What I really want is I want somebody to change. So I think there's a bigger nuance here that we need to get on top.
Well, and I think there's another sort of interesting layer that we can dig into this, because it seemed like there were some, Charlie, perhaps you're identified Democrats for education reform who did win Tuesday night. So you have Andrew Cuomo in New York, Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island, Dan Malloy in Connecticut. What did you take from those races?
Democratic pragmatists on education won, and it's a winner for Cuomo, it was a winner for Malloy, it was a winner for Hickenlooper. Gina, I think, it'll be a win for her, even though she wasn't an incumbent. So for Democrats, I think that's the lesson. And the other thing that's interesting is I hear people talk is The unions could get themselves out of this conundrum tomorrow if they wanted to. They're taking positions that aren't even the interests of their own teachers. They should be making the case that please don't cut our pensions, or if you cut our pensions, let's move towards a salary and we'll up the standards for being in the profession, and we'll stop trying to protect teachers who shouldn't be in the profession or excuse poor performance. They could turn that around tomorrow. They're not locked into where they are, but this trend's been happening for a long time, and there have been wake-up calls all along the way. I mean, NCLB was one, and they screamed. And
Rick, go ahead.
It's not clear they've learned their message, but learned their lesson. But they could turn this. There's nothing inherent about being a union in this that's fatal to them.
You know, I think there's a really interesting point here, which is, so, 31 states of GOP governors, right? We thought Republicans would probably lose a couple mansions, and said they picked up a couple. In almost every one of those, the unions have identified themselves as the enemy in a very real way. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. Look, Charlie just pointed out that the fact that you're modifying pensions like Walker in Wisconsin is an open question. Do those dollars get put into current expenditure in classrooms or not? The debate's not settled once you've modified the pensions. You do away with step accrual for degrees the lanes for the degrees in North Carolina. Those dollars did not get put back into teacher compensation, but they certainly could have been. What's strange to me is that unions have allowed this to become a black and white issue where I think, like Charlie says, they're really on weak footing, instead of saying, you know what, we actually agree a lot with some of these Republican Senate candidates that we're not crazy about some of what the Obama administration has done on waivers. They could have used that as a chance to find common ground and have a conversation. They didn't. Max Eden here at AEI and I did a piece. It turns out if you read the web platforms of the candidates for governor, 20 of the 35 Republican candidates for governor called for increasing school spending. That might have suggested that if unions were like, look, we're going to be open to anybody who wants to spend more on schools, everything else is details, that they could have actually been on reasonable terms with these folks. Instead, many of these same folks who were bragging that they wanted to spend more for schools came under the gun of the unions. If you're going to play it that way, you better darn well win. Otherwise, you wind up with no reason that you're going to get a hearing at the State House for the next 4 years.
Great, so let's maybe dig into a couple of these state-level races. So Allison, I'd like to start with you, and can you help us make sense of the Marshall Tuck, Tom Torlakson race out in California and what that sort of means for California moving forward?
So actually, I probably should have said that not Marshall Tuck, but Barack Obama was the big user. I realized it right after you passed me.
It wasn't about him. I listened to him yesterday.
Yeah, no, it wasn't about him at all. But having that, since I did say Marshall Tuck, I mean, for one thing, it's hard to mess with CTA. I mean, they're huge, they're big, they have long tentacles, long roots in that state. But, for better or worse, we in the media set up that race as reformers versus unions, and when Marshall Tuck lost, it didn't look good for reformers. It just didn't.
Can I just comment on that?
Sure.
I was going to say this based on your union comment. I actually think some people look at the Torlakson race and think that the unions won that. I don't see it that way. I actually think when Tuck started this, nobody thought he had a chance. I mean, you look back at really when he was getting this off the ground, running against Tom Torlakson seemed crazy. And the fact that it was as close as it was, I think is a huge problem for unions.
Well, and I would also add to that, too. I totally agree with Alice, with both of you on this. There's another piece. Reformers weren't for Marshall Tuck. Maybe the 1,000 people who actually are reformers whose names we could probably find in the phone book were for Marshall Tuck. The people of California don't like their state superintendents because they mean regulation and they mean we're going to take over your schools and we're going to tell you what to do. And that's left, right, and center, up and down. That's why California still has more homeschoolers than any other state in the country, not by per capita because it's a big state, but by per capita, right? It's a huge, huge independent state. They don't like that race. They think it's irrelevant. They want their own communities to rule, and I think they probably didn't pay much attention.
Charlie, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I'm going to ignore Jeannie's bait, but then it is tempting. Not a state that runs things very well. I don't think people are afraid of the state running anything in California. Look, Marshall Tuck won the air war. If you took his opinions and you matched them with the public opinions, he won. The unions had ground troops to get people out to vote, and that's where people like Tuck are going to fall short. I don't know what conversations took place for the people who supported Tuck in terms of whether they discussed doing a real get out the vote drive for Tuck like anybody who's worked for a good campaign has ever seen. Maybe they decided that's not what they wanted to do. Maybe they decided that wouldn't work, but that's what makes the difference. And, again, go back, the union's defending the Vergara case. I mean, anybody who watched the testimony in that or looked at the facts, really hard to come away from that, say, even if you don't like the decision per se, or Rick might disagree with that as a tool for changing public policy, the stuff that they had to defend in court was indefensible, and even the experts they brought in just didn't even have, their facts straight. It was pathetic. And they're still in the position of trying to defend that. So I think Tuck is where the people of California are. The CTA will be the last union in the United States to turn around. They are a lagging indicator of change. And I think California in education right now is a lagging indicator of change, and they could turn that around tomorrow too if they wanted to.
Just a question for you guys. Do y'all think that Torlakson, when you look at what he talked about and what he said he wanted to do you think he was the candidate of the CTA, or was he simply the stalking horse that the CTA supported in order to block Tuck?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, they put him up because they knew that he would work with them, but try to be an elected official in California and go up against the CTA. I mean, it's not easy. And it's as big a state as it is, it's a fishbowl. I mean, I worked for a member from California who didn't mind going to battle with the CTA. In fact, he looked forward to it because he saw this coming a long time ago. But it's not easy to disagree with the pack there. You will have a lot fewer friends, and you're most likely going to get kicked out of office if you do that. So it's not an easy state to buck, and so I think anybody in Torlakson's position would be doing the same thing he's doing, because it doesn't really matter who it is, they're just going to run it, whoever it happens to be. The CTC there, the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and some of the other they're not very different from that. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Republican, it's not like he went to bat on these issues either. I mean, he pretty much capitulated on doing anything tough on education himself. So it's across parties. It's a
Well,
state-
Schwarzenegger tried and got chewed up in the referendum.
Yeah, and it's
all the air went out.
It's hard to do things from Sacramento. I mean, maybe that's not a good model either.
Sure,
So I
Jeannie,
agree.
you wanna-
Yeah, I mean, I agree the CTA will be the last union probably to change across the country. I don't know, maybe next New Jersey. But the reality is, I think they're a paper tiger. I think you're giving them too much credit. It's badly run campaigns, or let me put it this way, not a long enough jump that a lot of these Republicans take, or a lot of sort of the non-union candidates take to get there. It's not about the unions just won. It's that we have candidates that wake up in the morning and think all they have to do is run a year-long election. They're suddenly going to get the attention of people in a state the size of the country. It's a lot more complicated than that. So I just think they've got an easy, access point and a lot of money, but you can totally, and we've seen people totally win that state that don't have necessarily union pedigree.
But Jeannie, you brought up a word that we haven't heard yet actually on the days, which is money. So it was an incredibly expensive campaign on both sides. So moving forward, what does that tell us about? So now just to get to be the superintendent in California, what was the total between $25 and $30 million, somewhere in there? So does that make reformers more gun shy of getting into these fights? Does this say this is what it's going to take?
No, so, and that doesn't, by the way, count all the unearned, unspent money that was just labor. I actually think if you take a page out, and I hope I'm not jumping the gun, Mike, if you take a page out of a Charlie Baker and frankly a Larry Hogan race, it makes the point. It's not about how much money you spend, it's about where you are and where you're visible. I would argue that part of the reason that a lot of people have said, including some folks at the table, education really wasn't that big of an issue, but you're right, it was sort of up there, but it didn't so much win, reform didn't so much win as other issues lost. But the reality is, the people who won that were kind of surprises did things that other candidates in their position, and particularly as ours, did not do. Like Hogan went to Baltimore City. He went to Prince George's County. He actually talked to real people about real issues and didn't BS them into thinking that he actually believed something he didn't believe. Baker did the exact same thing. The night of the election, he embraced Beth Anderson, who's a liberal Democrat who founded a very, very constructivist charter school, right? I mean, these things happen for a reason, and it's not because so much money. So I think all of that money that they're spending in California on media, despite the media buyers and the political consultants, really bad money spent.
Yeah, I think that's the Rand Paul playbook too. I mean, the things those candidates did that you said they did, that's where he's heading.
Yeah.
So that's gonna.
So let's pivot out of California and let's look at, I want to talk about two sets of races here that I think kind of each have something in common. So the first, I think Rick had mentioned them earlier, these sort of Midwestern purple state governors, Scott Walker, Rick Snyder, John Kasich, who over the course of the last 4 years have really pushed hard on things like collective bargaining reform, pension reform, school choice, and others. Where do they go from here? Allison, you want to give it a
I mean,
shot?
they could run for president.
Just say, yeah, Walker and Kasich are going to
sort
Des
of-
Moines. We know that.
Yes.
That's sort of what I'm expecting.
Rick, do you have some guess as to where these folks, so they've notched up some of these big victories, they seem to have withstood what was happening, where are they headed?
Seriously, right? I mean, Walker, Kasich runs. I mean, what's really interesting about Kasich, I think, was he got humbled by that referendum, right? When they did the collective bargaining reform in Ohio, they made the mistake of rolling in cops and firemen. Yeah. And turns out the cops and firemen, the public really likes teachers, but you don't want to apparently get on the wrong side of cops and firemen, because they play really powerfully. And Kasich got really whacked in that referendum, but he came back strong. He won huge in Ohio. And look, I mean, the guy's message, real clear, including page 1 of the Washington Post about a week ago, was, "I'm my own man." And so that's clearly how he's going to run. Walker is clearly going to run as a guy who can get this stuff done and find a way through and then hold the throttle. I think the most significant stuff from these three contests, actually, is going to be that the message for a whole bunch of other up-and-coming Republican legislators and lieutenant governors is, you know what? And I think this is one of the differences between Republicans and Reform Democrats on ed reform, is what you see in Marshall Tuck, the Marshall Tuck race, is this real challenge. If you're running as a Democrat, you're fighting against your left. And so you've got to try to hold the centrist Democrats, and then obviously you're going to need support on the right. But it turns out that a whole lot of Republicans either don't care about a Democratic on Democratic kind of contest, or they're still going to vote for the Republican even if they think the Democrats got nice ideas on school reform. On the other hand, a Republican isn't caught in the middle of this two-front war in the same way. And so I think what you're going to see is a whole, several folks in leadership positions in state legislatures, lieutenant governors who are thinking about running for, the governor's mansion 2 years from now, are going to start talking about school vouchers, tackling pensions and collective bargaining as a way to score cred, a way to impress and win over the Republican money people. And what they're going to take succor from is the idea that even in Ohio or Wisconsin, even when they paint the target on your back, you can still beat the unions.
Sure.
And I think that's going to be a real, that might, and frankly, if you get 10 or 12 folks talking about this instead of 2 or 3, it also means it's harder for the unions to take them on.
Sure. Now, not all of those folks will win. So conceivably, they all have to still govern their states for the next 4 years. So outside of the sort of presidential angle on how they're trying to position themselves, if you're a citizen of Michigan, if you're a citizen of Ohio, a citizen of Wisconsin, what do you expect your governor, with respect to education, pushing for the next 4 years?
So I was just going to say, as Rick was talking, and I agree. I actually don't think the play is on, are you going to run for president? They're going to start building up their base of state legislators, right? So one of the first things that went through my head was, about 10, 15 years ago, more so, around 15 years ago, when there was this amazing crop of governors who ushered in most of the education reforms we've been talking about today. Yes, they actually did start before Michelle Rhee and Barack Obama arrived on the scene. But all these reform governors, including a handful of Democrats, including even before that a Bill Clinton, right, had a state legislature that they could rely on. And they helped find them, get them elected, and then these state legislators built up these policies. And we've actually had weak state legislatures across the country, and both Republicans and Democrats had sort of wake up in the morning and have no idea even education reform is an issue, and it takes a bunch of us a long time and a lot of money and resources to convince them there's actually something going on. And so I think that while that's gotten better and better in terms of knowledge base, these governors are going to spend a lot of time building up their friends and bases in both parties.
Sure.
Right, and this is another place where the union's throwing the fight in a way. I mean, Scott Walker can push more choice in Wisconsin and get a state legislature, but I mean, really, Milwaukee is about as choice heavy as you can possibly be, and they're not knocking the ball out of the park. And there's very little evidence that more choice there is going to improve education in Milwaukee. But the Dems are sort of just giving them that. If the debate is choice, no choice, I think the public's going to go with choice. If the debate is choice, but with some quality oversight and trying to make sure that there's a menu of schools, and I'm not getting into the private-public thing here because I think that's increasingly blurred, but just the choice, the Democrats really haven't engaged on that, and it hasn't happened in Michigan either. I mean, the Education Achievement Authority was sort of doomed from the outset. I mean, Nelson Smith wrote a good paper on this, and it is more nuanced there, but there was never a coalition that came together around making sure that there were more options for kids and that making sure those were good options.
Sure.
So the Democrats are throwing that fight. They're not getting in the middle here where there's a middle space. I'd say the same space exists in Arizona. It exists in Texas, places where there's a lot of choice, and some of the choices could be a lot better than they are now.
Allison, looked like you wanted to jump in there.
Oh, well, on state legislatures, I would push back, I guess, on the idea that they haven't been consequential, because I think that that's where Common Core has run into the most trouble, is in state legislatures. And I think the Republicans picked up, I think it was 11 state houses across the country. And I'm really curious to see, if we're going to see more backlash against Common Core, it's going to be, I think, from those folks.
Not to upset everyone, but I guess I would take that pushback because I wasn't including Common Core in reform.
Okay,
I think
fair enough.
I think it stands in a category of its own that could include some elements of reform, but more sort of choice, accountability, teacher reforms, that kind of thing. But I agree. And by the way, if they do start going that way, where they sort of become more Rand Paulian on the Common Core, I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, whether I like Common Core or not, because it means that that's where they're isolating themselves. And I think that these governors are going to have to make sure that they don't have legislators that are only focused on whether there's standards or not.
Yeah, I think this is an important thing that we should dig into. So, Allison, I think you're right with the numbers. What I have is that now there are 66 houses across the country, so either in states, either Senate or House, that are Republican-controlled. 28 are Democrat-controlled, 2 are undecided, 1 is tied. Only 10 states have a totally dominated Democratic legislature, 3 of which are Illinois, Maryland, and Massachusetts. So what's on the agenda at the state level? How does that look? Particularly, Bethany, I may kick that one starting to you. With such a small number of sort of Democratic states, and now especially some of them that have seen their governor's house shape, what are they going to be up to?
So I think it comes back to the point Charlie made earlier, which is the winning is not the hard part. It's what you do once you have the job that makes it really hard. And I think a lot of this is incredibly unclear. I think there's a lot on the table. It is very unclear that in most of these cases, it's very unclear they won on education. It's unclear that that's the thing they're going to put up there first and go ahead and try to move on. If you had a split, I don't know why that would be the thing where you would see the most potential compromise right off the bat. There's much more in a state that needs to be done. So I sort of fail to see this as the likely place we're going to go.
You know, I think Bethany's right. I mean, right. People have been trying to read the tea leaves on these state superintendent elections. So obviously to California, but also Georgia and Arizona. But look, Georgia and Arizona, the state superintendent races were down ballot races in red states. I don't think many people went to the polls thinking, I'm really concerned about where the state chief stands on merit pay or testing. I think they were like, I'm voting for senator, I'm voting for governor, let's go ahead and yank the lever for the party while I'm here. And so I think a lot of these guys are showing up, and you saw this Republican tide. I mean, 66 legislatures. I mean, I think this is the highest since the 1920s for as far as Republican control. And And look, for these guys, like Bethany said, they didn't run to go do things on higher ed or pre-K or K-12. But frankly, as Republicans think about the issues they want to tackle, about how do they make sure the party is addressing kitchen table issues, how do they make sure that they do something with this victory, I think education is inevitably going to be a big part of that conversation because it's such a huge part of state budgets, because it's such a direct concern to their constituents. And I think it's actually potentially going to be a very fertile opportunity for ideas and for conversation, which again is, I think, part of why the unions are probably thinking, their strategists are thinking right now, gosh, maybe we would have been better off if we had spent a little more time trying to cultivate relationships and ideas in both camps.
So, go ahead, Allison.
Oh, just on state legislatures, I'm curious to see if now that Barack Obama is less popular and has less fewer competitive grant dollars to give out, if we'll see any of these laws that state legislatures put in to win Race to the Top or to get a waiver, if we'll see any of those rolled back in places like Georgia.
And I know this too. I mean, right? You think about how much reform-minded Dems, in particular, were able to coast on the president's popularity and on Secretary Duncan in 2010, 2011. Obama has developed this enormous reverse Midas touch, and so all these ideas that were popular and attractive to kind of moderate Dems, I think there's going to be a whole lot of we've got other stuff we'd rather talk about.
Yeah, no, so if I want to pivot here too, so we talked about this first set of governors where the sort of purple states, they've been working for a few years and they sort of withstood the onslaught. There's this new group of really blue states with new Republican governors. So we've talked about Maryland, Illinois, Massachusetts. What do they do? Some of them ran saying, we love what Scott Walker did, we love what John Kasich did, but the conditions on the ground are slightly different in Maryland and Massachusetts than they are in Ohio. So what are they going to do to sort of start on this education reform path?
So you have to break them down, I think, separately, right? So Bruce Rauner made very clear, education reform was his number one issue. I mean, yes, he talked about a bunch of stuff, but he had counselors, he had people coming in from across the country, he got an advocacy group, putting a bunch of us together and talking to him. He made it very, very clear that it was about education, and so he's going to have, and in the meantime, he was cultivating, and other people in the state have been cultivating reform-minded Democrats. So there may, in fact, be a marriage there of a promise for education reform, and I think he's bound and determined to show it's not a partisan issue, which is the second. Second goes Massachusetts. Charlie Baker was very effective in saying it's not a partisan issue, right? That Massachusetts was a leader in education reform, so no, it wasn't his top issue, but he made it very clear it's not a partisan issue. Again, I harken back to 15, 20 years ago. A lot of the governors who actually gave us reform said these were not partisan issues. Yes, it's a hell of a lot easier for a Republican to eschew a traditional establishment or union base of a Democrat, but they want to get in there and make the same kind of strange bedfellows that a lot of people did before. Maryland, God knows, our legislature is just pathetic. So Larry Hogan's got a big job on his hands, but Chris Christie came to the state 4 times and Democrats still voted for him.
Yeah.
So go figure.
Sure. Charlie, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I think Jeannie made good points. I mean, in Illinois, I think you have a lot of Democrats who'd be willing to work with Rauner on things where there's probably a lot of common ground, and that could be to the good of kids in Illinois and in Chicago.
And when you say that, are you saying charter schools, pensions? What might be some of these issues?
On pensions, I said this, and Rick, I kind of heard agree with me that the pension discussion should really be taking place in a broader context of what are you doing with the savings? Are you reinvesting it in education? If you're reinvesting in education, where are you reinvesting it? There's things here that are clashing with each other. We're expecting more from teachers, and we want to raise the bar for teachers. We also realize that these pension plans are generous in a way to teachers that they are for very few other public employees, let alone private employees. But at the same time, you're asking more of them. Do you just want to gut something you already promised them, even if it seems excessive compared to what other people in the society get? Or can you come together and say, hey, listen, this is costing us a lot of money. We need to change this, but we're willing to work with you and say, hey, we're going to raise the bar for teaching, and at least some of this goes back into education. Illinois didn't have that debate, really, when they discussed pension reform, and that's the debate that's going to happen. Massachusetts has a pretty long history of bipartisan cooperation on education, and even in Maryland. I mean, Nancy Grasmick was state superintendent under successive Republican and Democratic governors. If you don't know who Nancy Grasmick is, she was there for years, pretty much pushing the same policies regardless of administrations. Jeannie knows the Maryland legislature better than I do. I defer to you on that, on whether those kinds of things are still possible now, but there is a history in those places around doing things like that. I mean, Massachusetts, they got charter schools that are knocking it out of the park, and the Democrats are trying to, throttle charter schools. I mean, that ought to be an easy one coming out of the box. And I'm not just saying charters for charter's sake, but you got a case there that there should have been more outrage over that policy change than there was.
Well, in Massachusetts, I think the Democrats are still veto-proof in both houses, right? So, I mean, there's only so much. If you're governor, and there's a slight chance I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. And if you're Charlie Baker in that situation, there's only so much you can do. A lot of it's bully pulpit and conversation, because at the end of the day, if they have the votes, they have the votes. Actually, which also does remind me, two people we left out of the worst night conversation, who pretty much put, we can put the knife in them because they're done, is Martha Coakley and Charlie Crist. I hope both of them are having a nice vacation right now.
All right, I think it's time to pivot here to Washington, D.C. So with a new Republican-controlled Senate, when depending on how it shakes out, how big of a Republican cushion, we're going to see Lamar Alexander. We were talking earlier that David Cleary had the best night of the evening. So what are the implications of having Lamar Alexander as the chairman of the Senate Help Committee? Bethany, maybe you have a great deal of experience there. If you could start.
Sure. So, I think Lamar Alexander has a real opportunity here that's to make a good deal and move forward on ESEA, which is long overdue, incredibly painful. There's nobody who's sort of in favor of the status quo, but there's some obstacles there, right? It's the Senate, so you need 60 votes. It's going to have to be a bipartisan bill. Patty Murray is a very good partner in deal making. She's a pragmatist, but she wants to do something good for kids. If he thinks that the bill he put out in the last Congress that does nothing but rollback is going to work for her, he does not know her very well. It's going to have to be something that he can make the clear case to her is good for kids. And if they can find that middle ground together, I think there's a chance you could move something in the Senate. But there's going to be a temptation to say, wait a minute, we just won this everywhere, so it's our way or the highway. And that may be an overwhelming feeling Republicans have right now, but that is not going to get you very far in the United States Senate, because it just can't work that way and move forward. So I think there are some potential, they may get in their own way, but if they don't, there's some opportunity there.
Sure. Allison, do you see it the same way, differently?
No, I think Bethany's right on that. I would add, though, that Patty Murray is represents one of the very few states that had its waiver pulled because of teacher evaluation. She's up for re-election in 2016. Back when they pulled the waiver earlier this year, the state lawmakers had her in. They're like, can you convince Secretary Duncan to give us back our waiver? And she said she couldn't, but she really wanted to see reauthorization. She's going to try really, really hard to move this forward, I would think, because she needs to deliver for folks back home on it.
Sure. So maybe let's talk about looking forward of the Congress. So before the new Congress is even inaugurated, we have a lame duck session. By my count, ESRA, the Education Sciences Reform Act, passed the House, was approved by Senate Help, and it didn't go anywhere. The charter school bill, H.R. 10, the way I understand it, was passed the House and is sitting in the Senate right now. Do we see any chance of either of those moving in the lame duck? Are they moving later, or are they dead in the water?
So I think the piece of legislation that has the best chance to move on education is actually the CCDBG, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which I think actually has passed both houses now and is just waiting for conference. And then ESRA, I think, could move potentially in the lame duck. It has a good shot. I don't think the charter bill does. I think that if they can't get a deal on ESEA, the charter bill might become like, hey, we did something on education. Because really, I think Senator Harkin was kind of the stopping, I guess, the stumbling block on that, because he wanted a comprehensive ESEA. Once he's out, that bill has more legs, or sturdier legs. But only if they are not able to get some kind of a broader deal on ESEA.
And I would concur that probably nothing's going to get through, maybe the childcare stuff. I don't know much about that. I don't think it's an entirely bad thing the charter bill doesn't go through, because I do think there's a lot of Republicans that feel very strongly that it's very top-down. But what I would say about being able to do something post-January is we forget, I agree absolutely, Bethany, that Patty Murray has to have something to do with, right, what moves forward. But we have to remember who Lamar Alexander is. It's really actually kind of extraordinary. We've never had a person like this in this position. Former governor who knew about this stuff when he was governor, right? Secretary of Education, and now now in charge of the Help Committee.
University president.
And university president. I mean, this is a different kind of guy. If he has to go to 99 senators personally and get them on board, he will. To sort of move things forward. He's not going to just rule top down and let things defer to other people. And I think we're going to see a lot more of him, whether Patty Murray agrees or not.
So I'm actually highly skeptical that anything gets done for a couple reasons. One, remember, with Congressman Miller retiring and Senator Harkin retiring, you're not just using them and all of that institutional knowledge. They've been, they've had the staff who know this deeper than anybody on the Democratic side. So you've got to actually, it takes a time for these conversations and these relationships to kind of recongeal. So that's one thing. Second is, let's remember before education and the HELP title is health, the Republicans are going to spend a little time on something called the Affordable Care Act. And my impression has always been that that's not as near and dear to Senator Alexander's heart as the education stuff. But this is actually what's going, whether they take a full frontal assault, whether they're talking about medical device taxes, these are things that are going to fall under his purview, that are going to eat up a lot of bandwidth. And then, look, on the back end, Bethany mentioned you need 60 votes. Folks need to remember that. With 45 votes, McConnell has very effectively been able to, stall out Democrats the last several years. The Democrats are going to have, probably 46, maybe 47 votes. So it's not like it's going to be easy to move anything forward in the Senate. And then, frankly, remember, the clock's going to stop sometime early in spring 2016. Well, as soon as kind of the candidates are settled, everybody's going to hit pause and want to wait to see how the dust settles in November. So you're working with maybe a 14 or 15-month clock from when the new Congress seats, I would argue, for anything to really get done. So the idea that you're going to be able to actually push through on HEA or NCLB in that time window is, I think, probably asking a lot.
Charlie, do you see it the same way, differently?
I think ESEA passes next year, but I wouldn't bet my life savings on it. I mean, there are going to be more plot twists than an episode of Scandal on this stuff. The signals of leadership they're sending out right now are, one, they want to first do a budget. And so within the budget process, you're going to start to have some debate over some issues. That may or may not poison the bipartisan well before you even get to ESEA policy changes. So look for conservatives maybe to go after some of the student loan subsidies to try to cut the budget. Look for them maybe to attach a rider to prevent the department from going forward with gainful employment regulations. Even though those are fairly weak compared to what people wanted, there's still dissatisfaction on the left and the feeling that they went too far. So if those things start to debate, then you're going to see maybe the whole climate change. The Boehner and McConnell had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today. It's very constructive in its tone. They actually mention education as something they want to do, and they actually mentioned charters specifically. But they did mention trying to move a bill. And I think I spent a lot of time around John Boehner at one time, and when he says something like that publicly, he typically means it. And when he means it, he knows how to get things done. So I think those things have to play out. And you don't know what the mood of your caucus is going to be until all these guys get to town. They may come here, fired up, or they may come here wanting to be pragmatic. So you got 7 new people at least coming on the Republican side who are unknown quantities in terms of how they're going to conduct themselves in that chamber. Maybe 8 if Cassidy instead of Landrieu comes back after the December election. And you got 5, 6, 7 guys who are running for president. And so this is suddenly their stage in running for president. It's not 2013, 2014 now. This is how do I advance whatever I want to be seen for as a presidential candidate on the stage of an education bill? And so all those things have to play out.
But you got this whipsaw effect too, right? Because, right, the House passed the Student Success Act. And so, right, Bethany just talked about the need, for instance, Senator Alexander and Senator Murray to find common ground. But if she's going to want Senator Alexander to move towards something that's involves more federal intervention, even than he's disposed to, he's then got to take that back to Chairman Klein. Part of the sticking point here is, look, I think Secretary Duncan's having the time of his life. He loves waivers. This is like the best thing ever. And, he's had his birthday. I guess his birthday was today, and so he's good. But I don't think he has any desire to give up waivers in the next 28 months. And it doesn't strike me that this has been a Department of Ed which has spent a lot of time worrying about precedent. And so I think they will be very happy to try to ride the waiver train to the very last day of the term. And then it's, Hillary Clinton's problem to figure out kind of what comes next. So I think even if Senator Alexander buttonholes the 99 senators, figures this out, cuts the deal. He and Klein sit down, they put it together. Boehner sells it to 240 pretty adamant conservatives in the House. They send it to the president's desk. I could very easily see him being like, yeah, veto. And, so I think it's not, I could certainly imagine like why the different players would like to see reauthorization happen and get us out of the waiver business. But at the end of the day, it just seems to me it's a very difficult needle to thread.
Rick Hess, a ray of sunshine on an otherwise cloudy day. No, Bethany, you
Well,
wanted
it
to
was when
jump
he
in.
said that we were going to have a Clinton presidency. That was a good moment. Thank you for that.
Bethany's like, measure my drapes.
I wish. So I would just say that I think there are a couple quick things. One is I think the point on timing is real. It takes a very long time to put these bills together, to put these deals together. It's very hard. It can be done. I mean, when you look at when we passed NCLB, it actually was in this time frame. It wasn't up against a presidential. So to your point about presidential elections and how those dynamics will play in, that is real too. I mean, the last time we had a Democratic primary, we had 3 members of the Help Committee all in the Democratic primary. Ask me how functional that was. So then the other thing that I think that's important that people are saying is that it's not only a question of the red and the blue that's going to fall out here. It's the moderate and the extreme. It's what are the attitudes people are going to bring in. I remember when the 2010 election happened, and literally the tone of negotiation changed the next day because the clear message that people took away and brought with them when they came in the door to govern is that we are not here to make deals, we are not here to govern, we are here to tear it up and tear it down. And if that's the attitude that people come in with, you're right, we won't get anywhere. And so I think it's as much about whether people are going to be on the extremes, and I think your point about gainful is right too. If people come at this with, I have to take my pot shots and I have to get out there with the things that are red meat for my people, and then that does poison the well, and it makes it a lot harder to find deals.
So I think in terms of whether the administration would want to get involved, it's going to depend on how much traction issues like staggered or grade span testing end up getting. That's part of the reason that the bill in, not Bethany's bill in 2011, but the bill the next year, didn't end up on the floor because they were reformers. I think, Charlie, you told me this for a story, were frankly afraid that there was going to be a grade span testing amendment. I think that if NCLB went to the floor now, there would be. I mean, they could do, what did Bill Clinton want? Like 1 test in elementary school, 1 test in middle school, and 1 test in high school. So, and now, I mean, Obama has shifted his rhetoric on this too. So I'm going to be watching this issue and seeing how it plays out.
And at the risk of sounding like Pollyanna here, I'm just going to throw out another issue, though. Whether it's a time in a Congress that there's presidential elections running, whether there's NCL, whatever the dynamics are, these folks just had a huge wake-up call again, okay? And whether it's the Tea Party challenge to Mitch McConnell initially in the primary, or a bunch of new people, both at the state level and the federal level, I think they're going to move a lot faster than we're thinking. There's another factor, just going back to the state governor factor that I've written about, which is when there are strong governors in charge of their states that wants to get something done on education, Congress is not anywhere near, has not anywhere near as much proclivity to get in their way, and the governors demand stuff and make their Democrat and Republican senators react a lot more. We've just come through, when you guys were there, a 12 to 15 year period where all we heard from was Congress. Congress was strong on education. That is not the way that education reform started. And so by having strong governors back at the helm and having probably a strong NGA again and a bunch of state legislators demanding things, it's going to be the governors up on the Hill. I mean, how many governors have actually really been on the Hill on this issue in the last 4 to 8 years? Very, very few times. And we've let them get away with it, frankly, we collectively. And so now they're going to be showing up. They're going to be saying, this is what we do in Texas, this is what we do in Michigan, this is what we do in Massachusetts. You guys need to help follow us. And it's not going to be strong staffers and strong senators anymore telling them what to do. And I think that's going to be a whole new ballgame. And it may mean things move quickly. It also may mean we see completely new agendas that we've never heard of here.
Great. I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the crowd. Again, those of you following along at home, or even those of you that are in the audience, if you'd like to tweet questions, I'm going to apologize in advance. I just scrolled through the feed, and it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose because many of you are tweeting, which is great, and I'm glad you're doing. I'm going to try and maybe combine some of those tweets together that ask similar questions to maybe ask one. The last question I want to ask before we kick it over, though, is sort of wither the Department of Education for the next 2 years, right? What are they going to do for the rest of their time in office? Allison, I think you maybe start, and then we'll kick it over.
Suck up to states. They won't get rid of their policies. That's the answer.
Worst job ever.
Are they looking forward to a rough 2 years?
I mean, it's just going to be, if you remember talking to the folks in the Bush Department of Ed after the '06 election, they're not going to be able to convince smart, talented people to kind of go in and give them a blood transfusion because it's going to be not very fun. They're not going to get any money to play with. The initiatives that the Secretary likes to talk about, like, the President want to talk about, like pre-K, there's no new money, nobody's throwing any new money at pre-K. So basically what they're going to be doing is trying to play out the waiver train, but with a lot of pushback and maybe with some emboldened Republican governors. You're probably going to be looking at congressional scrutiny, even hearings on things like gainful employment, pushback on what the White House is trying to do on college accountability. It just doesn't seem like it's going to be, very fun or rewarding work for our friends over there.
Bethany, you look like you wanted to
I'm
jump
literally
in.
laughing because I joined the Clinton administration Department of Education the last 2 years, so that was like a slur on my talent, but that's okay. And I would say they have a lot of great people, right? Ted Mitchell's no joke, there's no joke. They have Robert Gordon. I mean, there's some good people in there doing some good work. And so I think they're going to actually, I don't know that I would write it off that way, especially because, to your point, if there's not going to be anything done in Congress, they are the game. And, you're saying they're going to be sucking up to the governors, and vice versa, because the governors need things from them now, and they are the only ones with the pen. People can say all they want about the waivers, but this administration acted when Congress abdicated. And so we needed the action. We couldn't just function under a totally defunct law. And so I can see a lot of opportunity for them. And I think in the end of the day, the last couple of years of administration are really about prioritizing, doubling down on the things you most want to see as legacy. And more likely than not, if we don't get something through Congress, which is more likely than not, what they leave on the table as the landscape of state and federal policy relationship is what's going to lead us into the next reauthorization. People are not going to go into that reauthorization and undo all of the things states have done under waivers. States are setting their policies under waivers, and they're not going to want to roll that back. So there is a continuing line of influence here that I think is significant.
I actually think the tone's going to be different. I think there's going to be a lot of humility at the department. You're no longer going to be able to show up on the Hill and demand that you have got an issue that's going to get resolved. So that's number one. The other piece of the tone, whether it's a policy issue or not, is really every single time the department does something that is not, outlined or enumerated in law or is not consistent with the way the Congress is thinking, they're going to get called out. They're going to get called out. It's going to be a constant reminder. And so I think the battle is going to be actually in the media. Watch for this, right? Okay. It's going to be in the media, it's going to be out there, and I actually think it's going to be healthy.
Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, that's the anti-Obama thing was what the Republicans who ran, that's what they ran on. So you're going to hear that in the ed debate. I don't know how much people are going to roll back the things they did, though. I mean, I think, it's easy to criticize them, but I think, they did a lot of things that I see very few states rolling back. New York's going to go back to the charter cap they had in 2009. they need to bust the one that they set in response to Race to the Top. States are changing their teacher eval plans, but nobody's getting rid of them. I'm not sure that, they did do a lot of good things and good in the sense that even when this money disappears from Race to the Top, and a lot of it already has, those things are still going to be around, and they're new and they need time to play out. But they do deserve a lot of credit. They had a vision, they pushed some things. They didn't really require that many things. They challenged people to do things and people stepped up and did them. But when you look at what people were required to do, really they were required to do very little. On the waivers, I don't know that every state that did a teacher eval plan just to comply with the rate waiver would continue to do its teacher eval plan without the waiver. But I also think that they came up with accountability systems that they're just starting to get to know. So I'm not sure that they want to start monkey wrenching them all over again. So the department did some good things, and I don't know. I agree with Bethany. I think they want to see their legacy through, and I think they have a legacy to be proud of. People can complain about how they did it, but what they did, I'm not sure when you get down to the policy issues that if we went down the panel here, there would be as much disagreement as it might sound like. If you talk about the what rather than the how.
Sure. Allison?
I'm just curious to see how much ownership states will take over these policies over the next 2 years. I think some really will. When I said they were sucking up to states, I also meant that they would be supporting them in implementation of their policies. But I do think that teacher evaluation in particular, Common Core, have been kind of slapped with the Obama stamp. And I'm curious, as they sort of step back, how many states will continue with those. I actually don't have the answer. I don't know how many.
Yeah.
But I'll be watching now.
No, that's a great place actually to start the question. So we'd like to open it up to the crowd and online. For those of you that haven't been to an AEI event before, in our question and answer period, we have 2 rules. Number 1, please state your name and affiliation. And number 2, if you would be so kind as to ask a question. We would prefer no soliloquies. From already online, lots of people want to ask questions. I think lots of people in the room do. So please ask a question, and then we'll be happy to respond, and I'll direct microphones to you once you raise your hands. But I want to start with one from Twitter, and then I'll take one from in the audience, because Allison, you mentioned this, and a lot of tweets were asking this about the Common Core. So what do we know about the Common Core today that we didn't know before the election? Where do we see that in electoral politics moving forward? Rick, you want to start?
Yeah, I don't think we know very much. Obviously, as folks know, in Georgia and Arizona, the state superintendents who were anti-Common Core beat Democratic candidates who were pro-Common Core. But look, like I said, I think when you're talking down-ballot races in red states, I don't think people are busy, worrying the details of what down-ballot candidates are talking about. You had a bunch of pro-Common Core governors win, including Republicans. You had some of them, like Cuomo. I have no idea where he stands on the Common Core at this point. There was some real gymnastics. You had a bunch of anti-Common Core governors win. I think the fact that you've got 66 legislative chambers that are Republican-controlled is going to be a real problem for the Common Core advocates. But I don't think this election was in any way, shape, or form about the Common Core. And I think it's hard to interpret this as, meaning anything particular. I will say, look, I think the only thing that's going to really matter for the Common Core is how well Jeb is polling in Iowa starting next November. I think if Jeb is polling really well in the primary, that is going to give a lot of encouragement to the folks who are trying to make sure that they can hold on to prominent Republican support. If Jeb runs and his numbers go south, the Common Core and immigration are going to take a lot of the blame, fairly or not, and I think you're going to see a real problem for trying to hold on to Republican support.
Great. Jeannie, did you want to add?
I owe a lot of the hostility and negativity on Common Core come from anti-Common Core to the fact that there was very little room for debate once it was accepted, right? So you had a bunch of people who don't like something, they start driving really fast to try to push it down and to try to be antagonistic. I think there's going to be a little breath now. Wow, we have a little time to actually look and open up the cover and really think about it. I'm not saying the people who weren't thoughtful yesterday aren't going to suddenly become thoughtful tomorrow on any issue, but I do think that those who have reasonable objections, and there are a lot, are going to actually feel like they're better heard, and I think those people who have reasonable support may have a little bit more time, might be a little bit more thoughtful about listening, as opposed to just saying, you're an extremist, you're an idiot, go away. Because most people in between who actually have an issue about Common Core, it's not about that, it's about what's going to happen when the superintendent says, this is the reading list, even though it says there's no reading list, because that's going on right now. It's implementation. It's just like NCLB was screwed up in implementation, the concern about implementation, I think there might be some more dialogue, and still standards coming out, but maybe again, some little bit finesse, maybe a different name, maybe some substantive differences, and a lot more discussion about what these tests look like, and what the cut scores are on the tests, and what they mean when they're actually administered.
Great. So question from the audience. Sarah, I see the gentleman there. So again, if you could be so kind as to introduce yourself and ask a question. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, hi, my name is Dave Price. I'm a retired educator, and I come here for AEI to hear engaging talk, which you gave, and the free diet root beer, which you have. So that's a wonderful thing. I want to steal from Mike a minute and do kind of a lightning round, if you would. Nobody really knows how this is going to shake out, but we have some changes. So we reconvene this group 1 year from today, and I'd like each and every panelist or any who want to say what they think will be the best thing that happened for kids in that time. I know that's asking for a crystal ball that you don't have, but based on what you know sitting there today, this thing I think will happen, and it was best for kids.
Great. Maybe we'll start with Charlie and head on down the row.
I mean, I think, somehow out of all this political combat, people can come around the middle and say, we want better teachers, and that means, like, starting with how they're trained, and they're not allowed to get into a classroom until they can prove they're good teachers, and we're going to pay them more. So you get the investment people want, and you get the quality that people want. That would be the best thing to come out of all this, and I think that would be good for both unions, teachers, parents, students, the whole system. Look, we tried to put teacher eval into a system where you have people that went through a preparation program, started teaching, and someone showed up with a video camera and they said, I've never been videotaped. There's not a clinical program in the country in any other profession that runs that way. So you got to start back there, and the deal is we're going to raise the bar and we're going to invest more, and the teachers union sees the writing on the wall and can get on board with quality. But I still think that's a stumbling block for them.
Bethany.
So I wouldn't disagree that that would be the best thing. It would also be the best thing if I got a Ferrari, and that's really unlikely as well. So given the career choice. So I agree, though, like something about teachers would be number one. I think in terms of realistically what I can see, I think the best thing would be if we make it through this assessment transition and are at a place where most of the states in the country, the vast majority of the states in the country, are not only giving assessments that are aligned against a better set of standards that are a higher level of rigor, but that the assessments themselves are of a higher quality and drive towards deeper learning, DOK, the things that will matter in teaching and learning, and that is something that could happen over the next year.
So I'm going to refer to something Bethany said early on in the panel, which was that education really did seem to play bigger in this midterm election than it has in previous years. So I think and this is partly just selfishly as a reporter, an education reporter, more attention on education a year from now would be a good thing for kids and not just reporters.
A year is a pretty quick time to actually see student achievement results for changes. But a lot of talk and a lot of momentum and a lot of people demanding more can result in student achievement. I think we should be measuring our gains by student achievement.
Rick?
I think in our system, the federal government can make people do things, can't make them do them well. And I think, as much as I agree with Charlie that in substance, I agree a lot of what the Obama administration has favored, I think it's been done in ways that have been real destructive. I think even if there's no statutory movement in the Senate, if there is a sense of more humility and a sense of dialing back what the feds are telling folks and making them feel like they need to do, I think that is going to be real healthy for how states go about important things like evaluating teachers and trying to improve schools.
Okay, great. I'm going to transition to one from Twitter. Again, combining a few Twitter questions together. A few people were tweeting about 2016. Education, there was a big push, ed in 08. Will there be an equivalent ed in 2016? Will one of these Republican governors or Republican senators that are trying to separate themselves from the pack make education an issue? Do you all foresee that happening? Why or why not? Bethany, go ahead.
we can probably say definitively no ed in 16, right? That was pretty much a disaster. But interestingly, I actually think the last time you saw the education play in a presidential in a significant way was actually the Bush-Gore race. And I think it was because there was a Nixon to China effect of the position that then Governor Bush took. So I think there's a possibility for very interesting dynamics for education to come out of a 2016 race, but it really depends on who the candidates are and what positions they take to drive that interesting dynamic. You could see a Democrat who takes a strong reform position making really incredible progress. You can see a Republican who takes a strong interest in supportive position in education making progress. So there's good possibilities there.
Yeah, I think, Republicans are going to talk about education in 16. You're going to have a big field. You're going to have several governors. Obviously, assuming Jeb runs, Common Core is going to be a point of contention. So it's going to be in the mix for sure. But look, Bethany's right. Education was a defining issue in 2000, the exit polls told us, partly, though, because the economy was humming and because the nation was at peace. If we're talking about ISIL, or we're talking about Ebola, or we're talking about the Ukraine, education, like most other questions around infrastructure and domestic investment, are going to take a back seat. If people are feeling pretty good about the economy, and if the international scene is tranquil, education is going to play a larger role. And that's just the way this historically plays.
I would just simply add that we should all pat ourselves in the back despite controversy and arguments to the contrary, because I think we're in a time right now that we can't have a presidential election where education's not a big issue. It's a phenomenal thing to be able to say. It's absolutely going to be on the front burner, even if they're fighting about it, and I think it's better to fight about it than not have it on the front burner. I will say that I think that in terms of education, that election night was Jeb Bush's bachelor party.
All right, let's take another one from the crowd. Be so kind, very trans. Sarah, if you'd be so kind, be right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah Cromie with Education Finance Council. Will there be a reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act in 2015?
Thank you.
So, I would say, given this bandwidth issue that I pointed to, at best you get 1 out of 3. At best you get HEA or ESEA or IDEA between now and when the trains stop running. And given Chairman Klein's strong interest in special ed, I think there's a huge opportunity that we have a lot of talk about HEA and ESEA, and the only thing that moves is IDEA. So I think if they decide that HEA, and it's interesting to note that especially in conservative circles, there's a lot of attention to the college questions. It's seen as a real opportunity for Republicans, A, to connect with the youth vote, B, to speak to real practical pocketbook issues, C, to kind of fight on turf that they haven't contested in a serious way in a long time. And so I think there's a chance, but I think it'll be 1 of the 3.
Allison, do you see it the same way?
I think there might be more agreement on HEA than on ESEA, but I would actually see Kelly Field from the Chronicle sitting in the back. So I would ask her and not me. She's the higher ed reporter.
Bethany, did you want to join in?
Yeah, I was going to say a similar point. I actually think, ironically, the path forward on HEA, I think, is much clearer. I think there's a lot more thoughtful policy presentation, people getting around some important things that need to happen in HEA. I think there's a lot of less contentious ways to go there. And yet, I think Senator Alexander's been fairly clear that he's going to start with ESEA, and I've never seen John Klein really that interested in HEA, and so I just don't see how that would get ahead of ESEA, and even if ESEA doesn't make it, it'll take a long time to die.
Charlie, you see it the same way?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, on the budget, we might see some scrimmaging on Higher Education Act issues. And so, depending on how that goes, it may decide some of the major things that people want out of that, or it may make it harder to do it, or may whet people's appetite. I'm not sure. But Bethany's right that Senator Alexander has signaled that ESEA is the first thing that he wants to do. And that seems like the plan. I don't think they would have written about it today. By the way, so much for reaching out with olive branches. So all the sort of, collaborative suggestions I threw out to the unions in my comments today, they said that I endorsed McConnell's and Boehner's op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal and their plan for education. So, we'll keep doing this. But again, the other thing you're hearing from leadership is they want to do budget first. And so budget will be before any of the policy discussion. So you got to keep that in mind. That's going to happen when these guys get back on the 2015 budget. That's going to happen on 2016 because these guys are going to want to, I think they're going to hold the deal that Mary and Ryan made on the 2-year budget, but they're going to start going at 2016. And so all that's going to start to happen before any of these policy committees start to meet.
Don't forget, education can be woven into the budget in lots of different ways without the reauthorization.
Great. We have Joel Packer's got a question here up front. Max is going to bring you a microphone.
Hey, Joel Packer, the Raven Group and the Committee for Education Funding. So just to follow up on the budget, I would posit that that's going to become hyper-partisan, totally divisive, and take up a lot of the time of the committee. So if indeed they do a budget at all similar to what Paul Ryan did, which the House has passed 2 years in a row, it assumed savings in student loans and Pell Grants. That would mean if they actually try to implement it, they would have to do reconciliation instructions to help and in the workforce, let alone reconciliation instructions about the Affordable Care Act. That will take up a huge amount of time and be very divisive. Plus, if they lower the caps on non-defense discretionary spending, which the Ryan budget did 2 years in a row, they're going to go down a path on appropriations that will be devastating for all education programs, and I think does poison the well on all these other possible issues. So my question is, what's your reaction about that? I mean, you didn't really talk that much. Charlie did a little bit about the budget, and the Republicans have been pretty clear. We're going to do a budget. I can't possibly imagine it's going to be much different than the budget the House has passed 2 years in a row.
Sure. Bethany?
Well, and don't forget Patty Murray's coming from the Budget Committee, right? She cut some of those. And so I think she's going to be very savvy about what's going to go on there. She's been on the Budget Committee since she got to Congress. She understands how that works and how to use it and how it can be used. And that's not something a lot of people understand on Capitol Hill. So I think you're right that there's a whole lot of possibility there to either take us down rabbit holes from which we never emerge, or to sort of quickly fizzle out. And I just think one point related to that, Jeannie said earlier, it's nice to see them fighting because at least it's up there and they're fighting about it. And I don't know, you go to countries like Singapore and you see what goes on in education, and the reason they make the progress they make is because people aren't fighting. They in fact have this shared vision and they move very purposely towards it, and education isn't a political issue. And it being at the top of the presidential election, I'm not sure is always a good thing, because I think it represents a lack of ability to say, we could fight about these budget issues and reconciliation instructions, but they're not in fact going to move the government. Nobody's got the votes, the 60 votes. So let's do something else that would make a difference for kids.
Joel, I mean, there's, you mentioned poisoning the well on the budget. I think this well is going to be heavily poisoned. Right? I mean, the president waited less than 24 hours to signal that he's probably going to move forward on, the question of illegal immigrants. McConnell already has sent the smoke signal on where that's going to take things. There's a whole number of issues like this. The likelihood that the president is going to want to strike significant deals on the kinds of issues we're talking about with a Republican Congress just doesn't seem very likely. There's lots of other stuff where there's enormously deeply held views, the stuff on which these new senators really ran, where there's just going to be a lot of loggerheads at the White House. So, figuring out, I think the reality is that the education stuff is going to get caught up in these much larger tides, and that's the way the world works.
Great. I'll take another question from Twitter. It's a question about what's the future of standardized tests. It looks like there have been some references to down in Georgia, the Republican candidate for state superintendent kind of rolled the Common Core into general anti-testing. We've seen on the political left as well. Some people have intimated moving to grade-band testing. So what is the future of standardized tests? Charlie?
People hate the word standardized. They like standards, but they hate the word standardized. I don't know. I mean, there have been like 5 proposals that have come out in the last few weeks, all of which say different things, some of which say conflicting things within the same proposal. We're going to have a debate about whether we should have annual testing. If we get rid of that, we take the debate, we take federal policy back to 2001. There's also going to be a debate about whether all kids have to take the same test. Some of these proposals are calling annual testing, giving test A 1 year, test B the second year, and test C the third year, from which you really can't get any gauge on progress, but it sure monkey wrenches things very well. That would take us back to 1993. So, and I don't think people have thought all these things through. One thing I just got to insert here, I mean, all of these discussions we're having are pretty reactive and small. And so I guess I would change my answer. Yeah, I think we should invest in teachers and have the other part of that deal be that we raise the bar. But what would be really good to see is some new ideas in this debate, and that would be something that could really come out of a presidential campaign. I mean, we're debating the same issues on accountability we've been debating for years. And the reality is you need apples to apples comparisons, and you need to test on some regular basis to see how kids are going. A lot of the people that are proposing otherwise have never been fans of anything we've done on accountability, including disaggregation of data, which everybody now supposedly loves. I can tell you what things were like in a back room that was not easy to get, as simple as it sounds. What about a debate on a different assessment system that's a little visionary, where we're talking about change in the name of innovation rather than change in the name of monkey wrenching? And I think the higher ed debate could bring some things out in terms of savings, but also a different model of post-secondary education, which is almost a sleeper issue. I'm surprised it didn't come up here more today, but I think we're going to move to a system where away from four-year degrees, different kinds of degrees conferred. I'll shut up and I'll let a couple other people talk. But I wanted to get that in for the debate because I think so much of what we're talking about here is reactive and small.
Yeah.
And corrective.
Sure.
And the best thing would be to start getting some different ideas in the mix, which doesn't mean the feds know everything or can dictate it, but they can sure lead that discussion. And right now, that's not happening from anybody on the Hill, and nobody on the campaign trail was really doing it either.
No, absolutely. Allison, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Oh, sure. So I think Charlie's right on, and I think there may be a debate, especially if the SCA moves forward, on whether or not we need annual testing. I also would really closely watch, and this is really wonky, so I apologize, a waiver proposal that New Hampshire has been talking to the department about to try out competency-based assessments in some of its districts during certain grade spans and only using the state test in some years. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like there might be some interest at the department in doing that. I would just generally keep that word competency-based assessments. I'm not exactly 100% sure what it means. Probably the folks over at Edweek to look more at teaching and learning probably have a better idea than I do as the political reporter. But that does seem to be where a lot of the interest is, definitely at the foundation level. And we've sort of seen that as stuff starts to percolate in foundations, so goes the federal government. So I think we'll start seeing more of this kind of, and some people would call it fuzzy, competency-based learning as kind of accountability 3.0.
Bethany, sure.
So I think it's a good question. It's real because there are a lot of bills out there, but a couple things to keep in mind. On one hand, I think this is the moment where formers, the business people, the civil rights people, they're going to have to decide, are they going to fight for these things that they've seen as cornerstones of accountability and of making progress, the progress that's made, setting a floor in the past few years. I agree with you. That's not how we're going to get to the ceiling, right? This is not what's going to catapult us to the next level of achievement and where we need to go, but it's been the floor, and giving that up should not be a small thing. But I would hope that when you look and you see that Alexander bills did not roll back testing, the Klein bills did not roll back testing, CCSSO recently came out with a statement from the states that reaffirmed annual testing. So while I think there is a risk, and I think people need to decide whether or not they value this, we've spent years fighting over how important growth was, led by the teachers' unions. You can't measure us on a status measure. It has to be about growth. You can't have growth without annual testing. I've heard Senator Alexander say many times, it's about the transparency of an accountability system. That is what true accountability means. Well, you can't have transparency if you don't have testing. So I think while this is a big debate, and I'm by no means complacent about it, I would hope that enough of the truths are there to drive us towards better answers.
Great. Sarah, if you'd be so kind, we have a gentleman who's been waiting so patiently, and patience should be rewarded. Up here, we'll see. Famous last words. Go ahead, sir.
Neil Snyder with the American Speech Language Hearing Association. Going back to your first question of who had a good and bad night, I think that Senator Roberts probably had an unexpectedly good night, but the knock against him was that he was out of touch. So if you're his chief of staff and you're looking at 6 years on the help committee, what are you recommending that Senator Roberts does?
Bethany?
Right. I mean, I think, so, yeah, ask me later for a great Senator Roberts story about NCLB and when he and Paul Wellstone came together on a testing amendment, but, but that's, I mean, I think, look, you want deals. You want ESCA, NCLB to go away. Nobody is in favor of it. When Rand Paul tried to hold up the markup in 2013, the only thing everybody agreed on was, good God, man, don't tell everyone else you're trying to stop us from getting rid of NCLB. So I think people want deals. HEA, you're right. There's so much going on in higher education that needs to push to the new level. So I think you want to be a productive part of making things happen. But I think they need to be things that are forward-looking, that are going to make a difference for kids, and not just coming back and saying my legacy was that I rolled us back to the era before civil rights were making a real difference in education.
Can I just jump in on the accountability issue? I don't know that I've got any advice for Senator Roberts, but I think there's a couple of pieces here, and I know that you weren't saying accountability or just the current debates per se are reactive and small. I think what's reactive and small is that we all assume that we all mean the same thing by accountability. Okay, and I think there's a lot of people out there saying that they're embracing tests and embracing accountability, and accountability for them means there's a bunch of people on 400 Maryland Avenue telling states and telling schools what to do, including, by the way, charter schools who started out trying to be different and have a different kind of accountability system for the same results. And so I think if we're going to have a great new debate, let's go back to NCLB and talk about why there was even tests. There were tests that were not content agnostic. Remember reading first? It was about testing people and making sure that states were actually teaching kids to read. And now we're backing tests and supporting tests and talking about accountability, regardless of whether or not we're saying you can go use a reading program or a math program that actually doesn't have results. So we've gotten away from content. We're talking about tests against some objective standards, and then, no offense, the publishers and all the traditional guys who were actually on the outs for a long time are back in and just creating a bunch of pablum like we used to have a problem in the first place. So let's bring back content discussions, because content actually is king, and let's talk about what accountability means in terms of content. That would be fun. I don't think it's small, and I don't think we're ever going to be Singapore, Bethany, because we don't wake up in the morning saying we all totally agree that education's important. We still have a lot of people who think it's okay to leave kids becoming janitors.
So, Rick, I want to maybe go back to the original question to you. If a Republican senator, one that's been called out of touch or felt to be, what are the one or two things that they should focus on to get back to the sort of kitchen table issues?
I think, look, one, they should say, it's crazy to say pre-K doesn't work or I'm against pre-K. It's equally, I think, crazy to say that the answer is to take the de Blasio model and export bureaucratic apparatus of K-12 into the early childhood space. It seems to me that this is actually a huge opportunity for Republicans, because Republicans don't have the same constituency issues when they want to challenge some of these norms as they do this stuff. In the K-12 space, I think a Republican ought to embrace exactly, I think Senator Alexander's got it just right. We shouldn't think about moving off from NCLB as a retreat. NCLB got some stuff right, annual assessment, reporting, disaggregation. It got some stuff profoundly wrong, I think, including having the feds get into highly qualified teacher kind of bureaucraties, and having the feds try to dictate to states what the heck you do about schools that aren't performing at a level you'd like them to. At the higher ed level, so I think at the K-12 space, there's an opportunity to say, look, it's not about rolling back or attacking NCLB. It's trying to figure out what we got right and how do we go ahead and insist upon transparency and comparability, at the same time respecting that in our system, all the federal government can do is write rules for schools, and that rarely is how you actually create excellent teaching and learning environments. At the higher ed space, I think it's saying, look, we actually want to make sure that students aren't getting rooked, but as Republicans, we don't have enormous confidence in the ability of bureaucrats at the Department of Ed to write rules which are going to micromanage the higher ed space. So what does it look like to talk much more thoughtfully and robustly about expected transparency? What does it mean to actually hold higher ed institutions to account, not just for student loans, but for federal dollars, which are going in institutions with post-World War overhead rates of 45 and 48% on federal grants? How do we actually talk about making sure that the investment by American taxpayers is benefiting kids, whether it's pre-K, K-12, or kids and students in colleges and universities? I think actually there's just enormous opportunities for conservatives to address this in a way that is going to speak to real concerns of real families.
Great. I think we'll end it on that. If we can give a round of applause for our panelists up here. Remember, 1 week from today, Cammie Anderson, 11:30.